Alarms tore through the metal walls of Outpost Kessler before Captain Daniel Hargrove even opened his eyes. He was on his feet in seconds, boots hitting the cold floor, heart already pounding. Red light pulsed through the narrow corridor outside his quarters. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. "Report," he said, sliding into the command chair before he had even finished buttoning his jacket. Lieutenant Grace Bellamy did not look up from her console. Her fingers moved fast, pulling data from every sensor the outpost had. "Unknown vessel, sir. Just dropped out of transit space less than 200 kilometers from our position. It's massive. Nothing in our records matches its shape." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Outpost Kessler was a small research station, built to study a quiet corner of space nobody thought mattered. It had no weapons worth mentioning. It had 12 people on board. It had never been meant for anything like this. "Options," he said. "Not many," Grace answered. "We could try to hail them. We could try to run. Frankly, sir, I don't think we can outrun something that size." Before Daniel could respond, the entire station shuddered. A deep groan rolled through the metal beams above their heads, like the outpost itself was in pain. Sparks burst from a control panel across the room, and the lights flickered before steadying again. "They fired on us," Grace said, her voice tight but controlled. "Shields down to 60%. "Hail them," Daniel ordered. "Now." On the main screen, the image resolved into something none of them had ever seen before. A tall figure with pale gray skin and eyes that seemed to shift color as it studied them. Its uniform was sleek, layered with plates that looked more like armor than clothing. Behind it stood two more of its kind, watching the humans with what looked like mild curiosity, the way someone might watch an insect they were about to step on. "You are trespassing," the figure said. Its voice was flat, translated by some unseen device into words the humans understood, though the rhythm was strange, almost musical beneath the surface. "This sector belongs to the Velkaran Assembly. You will surrender your station and your crew, or you will be removed." Daniel kept his voice steady, even though his pulse was racing. "This is a research outpost. We are not a threat to anyone. We've been here for 3 years without incident." The alien tilted its head slightly, as if the statement amused it. 3 years is nothing. You are young. You are small. Surrender now, and you will be treated fairly as prisoners of the Assembly. Resist, and you will be treated as pests. The word landed hard in the room. Grace's jaw tightened. Behind Daniel, one of the younger crew members, a technician named Oliver Finch, muttered something under his breath that Daniel chose not to hear clearly. "We don't surrender," Daniel said. "Not our station. Not our people." The alien's expression did not change, but something in its posture shifted, a kind of lazy confidence, as if it had expected exactly this kind of foolish defiance, and found it almost charming. "Very well. You have made your choice." The connection cut. The screen went dark for half a second before switching back to the exterior view of the alien ship, hanging in space like a mountain that had learned how to fly. "They're powering up something big," Grace said, watching her console with wide eyes. "Some kind of weapon system. I don't recognize the signature." Daniel's mind raced. 12 people. No real weapons. No warship anywhere near them. Outpost Kessler was hundreds of light years from the nearest human colony, and even if they sent a distress signal right now, help would take days, maybe longer, to arrive. "Send the distress call," Daniel said. "Full priority. Every frequency we have." "Already sending," said Communications Officer Emma Whitfield from her station near the back of the room. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice held steady. "If anyone's listening, they'll know within the hour." "An hour won't save us," Grace whispered. "Then we buy time," Daniel said. "We're not going down without trying." The outpost had few weapons, but it had resourceful people. Daniel had spent 3 years handpicking this crew, choosing engineers who thought outside rigid instructions, scientists who could solve problems with whatever was on hand, and support staff who had a stubborn refusal to give up written into their bones. It was time to see what that could do against something ancient and overwhelming. "Oliver," Daniel said, turning to the young technician, "how fast can you reroute power from the labs into the shield emitters?" Oliver's eyes lit up despite the fear on his face. "Give me 4 minutes. You have 2. Oliver was already moving, sliding under a console with a toolkit in hand, calling out instructions to another technician to help him pull cables from unused systems. Around the room, the crew snapped into motion, each of them finding some way to help, some way to fight back with the little they had. Grace worked to calculate the movement patterns of the alien vessel, trying to find any weakness in how it approached. "Their ship is slow to turn," she said after a moment. "Whatever weapon they're building, it takes time to charge, and once it fires, they'll need to realign before firing again." "How much time?" "I estimate 90 seconds between shots, if the pattern I'm seeing holds. Then we use every one of those 90 seconds, Daniel said. The station shook again as another blast struck their outer hull, this one glancing rather than direct, but powerful enough to send a shower of sparks raining down from the ceiling. Emma ducked instinctively, then straightened up again, refusing to let fear stop her from monitoring the distress signal. "Signal's out," she confirmed, repeating every 10 seconds. Daniel nodded, though he knew rescue would not arrive in time to stop whatever was about to happen. The point was not rescue. The point was survival, minute by minute, choice by choice, until either the aliens gave up or something changed. "Oliver, status?" "Shields rerouted. We just gained 15% capacity." Oliver rolled out from under the console, sweat on his brow, grinning despite the danger. "Not much, but it's something." "It's enough," Daniel said. "Grace, get everyone into position. If they board us, I want every non-essential system shut down and every essential system protected. We are not making this easy for them." The crew moved through the station with a kind of quiet determination that surprised even Daniel. Fear was there, plain on every face, but underneath it was something stronger, something that refused to simply lie down. Dr. Claire Whitmore, the outpost's only physician, moved through the halls checking on everyone, offering calm words even as the walls shook around her. Engineer Peter Voss worked alongside Oliver, pulling apart old equipment to build makeshift barriers at the airlocks, anything that might slow down an intruder, even by a few seconds. On the bridge, Daniel watched the alien vessel loom larger on the screen. It was patient, almost lazy in its approach, as if it had all the time in the galaxy, and no reason to hurry against such an insignificant target. "They're launching a boarding craft," Grace announced. "Small vessel, heading toward our secondary airlock." "How many?" "Sensors suggest 6 individuals aboard." Daniel allowed himself a brief, humorless smile. 6 against 12. Not the numbers the aliens probably expected to matter, not against a species they clearly saw as harmless. "Let them come," Daniel said quietly. "We'll be ready." The boarding craft docked with a heavy clang that echoed through the station. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the airlock door began to glow, some kind of cutting tool working from the outside, slicing through metal with slow, deliberate precision. Daniel positioned his people carefully. Peter and Oliver waited near the airlock with tools repurposed as barriers, ready to jam the mechanism the moment it opened. Grace stood at a nearby console, prepared to vent the corridor's atmosphere if things went badly wrong, a desperate last resort that none of them wanted to use. The door finally gave way, falling inward with a heavy thud. Smoke and sparks filled the corridor. Through the haze, 6 armored figures stepped through, moving with a calm, practiced confidence that suggested they expected no real resistance. They were wrong. Peter and Oliver triggered the barrier they had built, a mess of tangled cables and bent metal plating that collapsed across the corridor entrance, tripping the first of the boarding party and forcing the others to slow their advance. It was not a weapon. It was not meant to harm anyone. It was meant to buy seconds, and seconds were exactly what the crew needed. "Fall back to the secondary corridor," Daniel ordered over the comm. "Keep them chasing, not catching." The crew moved through the station with practiced coordination, always staying one step ahead, sealing doors behind them, redirecting power to slow the intruders without ever resorting to anything that could be called an attack. It was a strange kind of struggle, humans refusing to be caught rather than trying to strike back, buying time with cleverness instead of force. On the bridge, Grace kept a close eye on the timer for the alien ship's main weapon. 60 seconds until their next possible shot, she said. If they fire again while their boarding party is still aboard, they risk hitting their own people. Daniel's eyes widened slightly at the realization. They won't fire on us while their team is inside. Which means, Grace said, catching his meaning immediately, as long as we keep their people busy in here, that ship out there can't touch us. It was a small window, a fragile advantage, but it was something. Daniel relayed new instructions to the crew, urging them to keep the boarding party occupied without provoking anything worse, to lead them on a long, twisting chase through the station's corridors, while the seconds ticked away. For nearly 10 minutes, Outpost Kessler became a maze, its halls filled with the sound of pursuit, doors sliding shut just as pursuers reached them, lights flickering as power was diverted again and again, to keep every trick working just a little longer. The boarding party grew visibly frustrated, their movements less careful, their confidence cracking at the edges, as they realized this supposedly harmless species was proving far more difficult to corner than expected. Then, without warning, a new signal lit up on Grace's console. "Captain," she said, her voice suddenly urgent, "I'm picking up multiple contacts, dropping out of transit space. They're ours. Human signatures, Captain. It's a response fleet." Daniel felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since the alarms had first sounded. "How far out?" "Close. Very close. They must have been running at maximum speed since our distress call went out." On the main screen, the alien vessel outside seemed to hesitate, its sensors clearly picking up the same readings. Ships began appearing at the edge of the display, sleek and fast, moving with an urgency that suggested every pilot aboard understood exactly what was at stake. Inside the station, the boarding party froze, as new orders apparently reached them through their own communications. Without a word of explanation, the 6 armored figures turned and retreated toward their boarding craft, moving with none of the calm confidence they had shown before. Daniel watched on a nearby monitor as the small vessel detached from the outpost and sped back toward the larger alien ship. Moments later, the massive vessel itself began to shift, gathering itself for a jump back into transit space, retreating from a fight it had expected to win in minutes. The room was silent for a long moment after the alien ship vanished in a flash of light. Then, slowly, the crew began to breathe again, exhaustion and relief washing over faces that had been tight with fear only minutes before. "We held," Grace said quietly, almost in disbelief. "We bought time," Daniel corrected her, though there was pride in his voice he could not quite hide. 12 people, no warship, no real weapons. And we made them retreat. Emma looked up from her console, tears of relief in her eyes. "The fleet is hailing us. They want a status report." Daniel straightened his jacket, took a steadying breath, and nodded. "Tell them Outpost Kessler is still standing. Tell them we're ready to talk about what just happened here." As the human ships drew closer, forming a protective line around the battered but unbroken station, Daniel allowed himself one final thought before turning his attention to the reports that would need to be filed, the questions that would need to be answered, and the strange, unsettling truth that had just been revealed to a galaxy that had never truly understood what humanity was capable of. They had come expecting an easy target. They had left with a warning they would not soon forget. Somewhere far beyond the edge of human space, that warning was already spreading, carried by a retreating ship and a commander who would have to explain to their superiors exactly how a research outpost, with 12 unarmed scientists and engineers, had managed to hold off 6 trained soldiers and force an entire vessel into retreat. It was only the beginning. Commander Vesic Thorne stood in the observation chamber of the Velkaran flagship, staring at the tactical readout with an expression that had shifted, over the last hour, from mild irritation to something closer to unease. Behind him, 3 senior analysts waited in silence, none of them eager to be the one who spoke first. "Explain it to me again," Vesic said finally, his voice low and controlled, though the tension underneath was impossible to miss. "How does a research outpost with 12 unarmed scientists hold off a trained boarding party?" Analyst Cale Doran stepped forward, a datapad clutched in both hands. "Commander, we've reviewed the footage from the boarding team's equipment. They did not fight us in any traditional sense. They used the station itself as a weapon. Barriers, sealed doors, redirected power. They never engaged directly. They simply refused to be caught." "That should not have worked," Vesic said. "Our team was trained for resistance, For combat, not for a chase through corridors against people who refuse to stand still. With respect, Commander, said a second analyst, a quiet, precise woman named Alira Vance. Our team was trained to expect fear, panic, surrender. What they found instead was coordination. Every human aboard that station moved with purpose, even the ones with no combat training at all. It was as if resistance was instinct for them, not a decision. Vesic turned back to the screen, watching the recorded footage of the boarding party's retreat, the tangled barriers, the flickering lights, the sealed doors closing again and again just moments too soon. It did not look like the panic of a doomed people. It looked like something else entirely, something that unsettled him in a way he did not have the words to explain. Pull every record we have on this species, he ordered. Everything. Trade logs, diplomatic reports, historical archives. I want to know exactly what we are dealing with before we commit another ship to this sector. The order went out immediately, and within hours, a small team of analysts had assembled a growing file on humanity, drawn from whatever fragments of information the Velkaran Assembly had managed to collect over the decades, since first hearing whispers of Earth. Most of it had been dismissed as irrelevant. A young species, barely out of its own solar system, with primitive technology and a short history compared to the ancient civilizations that made up the assembly. No one had bothered to study them closely before now. That was about to change. Alira Vance was the one who found the first records that gave her pause. Old reports, decades old by human reckoning, describing encounters between human explorers and hostile environments across their own world. She read through accounts of humans descending into crushing ocean depths in fragile metal shells, climbing frozen mountains where the air itself could kill them, walking into burning buildings to pull other humans to safety, running toward disasters that every instinct should have told them to flee. This does not make sense, she muttered to herself, scrolling through page after page of similar accounts. Every species avoids danger. It is the most basic rule of survival. Yet here, again and again, this pattern repeats. They move toward the danger, not away from it. She brought the reports to Vesic personally, laying them out across his desk with a growing sense of concern she could not quite hide. Commander, I believe we may have misjudged this species from the very beginning. Vesic studied the reports in silence for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving across accounts of rescue efforts, exploration missions, and what the humans themselves apparently referred to, almost casually, as calculated risk. There was no fear in these records. There was determination, sometimes bordering on something that looked, to Vesic's eyes, almost reckless. They call this bravery, Vesic said slowly, reading a translated quote from a human account of a rescue mission during a natural disaster. They do, Alira confirmed. But Commander, look at the numbers. Look at how often this pattern repeats across their history. This is not an isolated trait among a few unusual individuals. This appears to be woven into the culture itself, expected of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Vesic leaned back, processing the implications. In his experience, most species reserved extreme risk for a select few, warriors or specialists trained and prepared for danger. But these reports suggested something different entirely, a species where farmers and teachers and engineers might just as easily run toward danger as any trained soldier, simply because someone needed help. Pull the medical records, Vesic said. I want to understand their physiology. If their behavior is this consistent, there may be a biological explanation. The medical data, when it arrived, only deepened the unease spreading through the command staff. Human biology, compared to most species catalogued by the Assembly, was unusually resilient. Their bodies healed quickly from injury. Their tolerance for physical hardship, extreme temperatures, and prolonged stress exceeded that of nearly every species in the Assembly's records. Even their psychology seemed built for adaptation, capable of adjusting to horrifying circumstances and continuing to function, continuing to fight, continuing to help others, long after most species would have simply given up. It is almost as if their evolution favored endurance and cooperation over caution, Cale Doran observed, reviewing the data with a mixture of professional curiosity and quiet alarm. A species that survived by refusing to quit and by refusing to leave each other behind. Vesic said nothing for a long while, staring at the reports spread before him. He thought of the boarding party's retreat, the confusion in their voices when they described the coordinated resistance they had encountered. He thought of the small, unarmed outpost that had somehow held off 6 trained soldiers, using nothing but ingenuity and stubborn refusal to surrender. "Contact the other commanders in the sector," he said finally. "I want a full council meeting. This is no longer a simple matter of expanding our borders. We need to understand exactly what we are dealing with before we make any further decisions regarding this species." The council meeting, held 2 days later aboard the Assembly's regional command station, brought together commanders and diplomats from across a dozen different worlds. All of them gathered to discuss a species most had never heard of until recently. Vesic presented his findings carefully, laying out the incident at Outpost Kessler, alongside the growing body of historical and biological data his team had compiled. The reactions in the room were mixed. Some commanders dismissed the concerns outright, arguing that a single incident proved nothing, that any species might get lucky once against an unprepared boarding party. Others, however, listened with growing concern, as Vesic detailed pattern after pattern of human behavior that defied easy explanation. "You are suggesting," said an older commander named Thessaly Kor, her voice skeptical, "that an entire species is somehow biologically and culturally predisposed toward extreme risk and resilience. That seems, forgive me, like an exaggeration built from a handful of unusual anecdotes." "With respect, Commander Kor," Alira replied, stepping forward to address the room directly. "We are not speaking of a handful of anecdotes. We are speaking of thousands of documented cases, spanning their entire recorded history, involving ordinary individuals from every corner of their homeworld. This is not exaggeration. This is a consistent pattern that our own analysts initially dismissed as irrelevant, precisely because it seemed too unusual to be significant." A murmur ran through the room. Vesic allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before continuing. "There is more," he said. "Our scouts have been monitoring human communications and movement since the incident at Outpost Kessler. Within hours of their distress call, a full response fleet arrived at the scene, moving at speeds that suggest a level of urgency and coordination we did not expect from a species we assessed as technologically unremarkable. Their ships are not as advanced as ours, but their willingness to commit resources immediately, without hesitation, in defense of a single small outpost, tells us something important about their priorities."
"What are you suggesting we do, Commander?"
asked another voice from across the room, a diplomat named Oren Vale, whose expression remained carefully neutral. Vesic considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I am suggesting caution. We approach this species as a soft target, based on limited information and a series of assumptions that may have been fundamentally flawed. Before we commit further resources to expansion into their space, I believe we need a clearer understanding of exactly what capabilities and characteristics we are dealing with." The council debated for hours, voices rising and falling, as commanders argued over the best path forward. Some pushed for an immediate, overwhelming show of force, arguing that any hesitation now would only embolden the humans further. Others urged patience, pointing to the unsettling data Vesic's team had compiled, and warning against underestimating an unknown variable. In the end, the council reached an uneasy compromise. A larger fleet would be assembled, not for immediate conquest, but as a show of strength, intended to convince the humans to accept a negotiated settlement, one that would grant the Assembly access to the sector without the need for further conflict. It seemed, to most in the room, like a reasonable middle path, a way to secure their interests while avoiding the risks that a full engagement might bring. Vesic left the meeting with a heavy sense of unease he could not quite shake. As he walked through the corridors of the command station, Illyra fell into step beside him, her expression thoughtful. "You do not believe a show of force will be enough," she said. It was not a question. Vesic was quiet for a moment before answering. "I believe we have spent our history cataloging species by their weapons and their technology. We have never truly accounted for a species whose greatest strength might be something far harder to measure. Determination, refusal to yield, a willingness to risk everything for people they have never even met." "And if the council is wrong?" Alira asked quietly. "If a larger fleet only provokes a stronger response?" Vesic did not answer immediately. He thought again of the reports scattered across his desk, of humans descending into crushing depths and climbing frozen peaks, and running into burning buildings, not because they had to, but because some deep, stubborn part of their nature refused to let others suffer alone. He thought of 12 unarmed people holding off 6 trained soldiers through nothing but cleverness and refusal to surrender. "Then I believe," Vesic said finally, "we may be about to learn a very difficult lesson about the true meaning of a predator." Behind them, the fleet preparations had already begun, ships gathering in the shadow of a decision that would soon test every assumption the Velkaran Assembly had ever made about the small, stubborn, endlessly resilient species they had so casually decided to challenge. Word of the growing fleet spread quickly through assembly space, whispered among crews who had heard fragments of the strange reports coming out of the council meeting. Rumors grew with each retelling, some exaggerated, some understated, but all of them carrying the same uneasy thread, that the humans were not what anyone had expected, and that the coming encounter might not unfold the way the council had planned. Aboard his flagship, Vesic reviewed the assembled fleet roster one final time before the launch, his mind returning again and again to the same unanswered question. Somewhere in the vast unknown of human space, a species was preparing its own response, and for the first time and longer than he could remember, Vesic found himself uncertain of the outcome that awaited them all. News of the retreating alien ship reached Earth's Unified Defense Command within hours, and by the time the first full reports arrived, the atmosphere inside the command center had shifted from cautious concern to something closer to controlled alarm. General Louise Fairweather stood at the center of the room, arms crossed, studying the tactical map that now marked the edge of human territory with a warning she had hoped never to see. "They're calling it the Velkaran Assembly," said Colonel Nathan Price, standing beside her, with a datapad in hand. "A coalition of species, spanning dozens of star systems. Old, established. And according to the reports from Outpost Kessler, they consider us a target worth testing." "Testing," Louise repeated, her tone flat. "They attacked an unarmed research station." "And retreated the moment our response fleet arrived," Nathan added, "which tells us something important. They weren't committed to a full engagement. They were probing us, trying to understand what we're capable of, before deciding how seriously to take us." Louise studied the map for a long moment, the vast, empty stretch of space beyond the edge of charted human territory, suddenly feeling far less empty than it had only days before. "And what have our scouts found since then?" Nathan hesitated before answering. "A fleet, General. Larger than anything we've encountered before. Still weeks out, based on current tracking. Moving slowly, deliberately. It doesn't look like an invasion force preparing for a quick strike. It looks like they're building towards something bigger." The room fell silent for a moment, as the weight of that information settled over everyone present. Humanity had only recently begun expanding beyond its home system, its colonies still young, its defense fleet still small compared to the vast unknown of the galaxy beyond. No one in the room needed to be told how serious this could become. "Options," Louise said finally, echoing the same question Daniel Hargrove had asked days earlier aboard Outpost Kessler, though the stakes now stretched far beyond a single station. "We reinforce every colony along the border," Nathan said. "We accelerate ship production, and we open communication, if they're willing to talk, because right now, we know almost nothing about what they actually want." Louise nodded slowly. "Then let's get to work." Over the following weeks, humanity moved with a speed and determination that surprised even its own leadership. Shipyards across every colony ramped up production, engineers working around the clock to complete vessels that had been years from deployment. Civilian volunteers signed up for defense training in numbers that overwhelmed recruitment centers. Ordinary people from every walk of life stepping forward, driven by a shared, stubborn refusal to simply wait and hope for the best. Daniel Hargrove, still recovering from the incident at Outpost Kessler, found himself reassigned to a growing task force, studying the alien fleet's movements and preparing defensive strategies for the border colonies. Grace Bellamy joined him, her sharp analytical mind proving invaluable as the team worked to understand exactly what they were up against. "They're not hiding their approach," Grace noted one evening, studying the latest tracking data alongside Daniel in a cramped briefing room aboard the growing task force flagship. "If anything, they seem to want us to see them coming." "A show of force," Daniel said. They want us intimidated before they even arrive." "Is it working?" Grace asked, a hint of dry humor in her tired voice. Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Not as much as they'd probably like." Across human space, colonies large and small, prepared for what many now believed was an inevitable confrontation. On the outer colony of New Meridian, farmers and shopkeepers took turns training alongside soldiers, learning basic defense drills between their ordinary daily work. On the industrial world of Calder Station, factories that once produced mining equipment now turned out defensive hull plating and makeshift weapon systems, engineers adapting whatever technology they had on hand into something that might help even the odds. It was not a perfectly coordinated effort. Mistakes were made, resources were stretched thin, arguments broke out among military leadership over the best strategy to adopt. But beneath the chaos and uncertainty, a quiet, stubborn determination held everything together, a shared understanding that giving up was simply not an option any of them were willing to consider. Aboard the approaching Velkaran fleet, Commander Vesic Thorn watched the growing activity across human space, with a mixture of curiosity and quiet unease. His analysts had continued compiling data throughout the journey, and what they had found only deepened the concerns first raised after the incident at Outpost Kessler. "They are mobilizing faster than any species we have previously encountered under similar circumstances," Alira Vance reported during one of their regular briefings. "Civilian populations are training alongside military personnel. Production of defensive technology has increased dramatically across every colony we have observed." "This is not the response of a species that expects to lose, Commander. This is the response of a species preparing to make any conflict as costly as possible for us." Vesic studied the reports in silence, his mind returning again to the historical records his team had uncovered weeks earlier. He thought of accounts describing humans throughout their history, facing conflicts against far stronger, better-equipped opponents, and finding ways to persist regardless, adapting, innovating, refusing to accept defeat, even when logic suggested they should. "Pull their historical conflict records," Vesic ordered. "I want a full analysis of how this species has handled warfare throughout their history, not just recent incidents." The analysis, compiled over several days, painted a picture that troubled Vesic more than he wanted to admit. Human history was filled with examples of smaller, less equipped forces finding ways to overcome larger, better-armed opponents through sheer creativity and stubborn persistence. Guerrilla tactics, improvised weapons, alliances formed and broken with startling speed, depending on circumstance. A species that seemed to treat every disadvantage not as a reason to surrender, but as a problem to be solved. "This is troubling," Cale Doran admitted during a private briefing with Vesic and Alira. "Our fleet outnumbers anything they can currently field. Our technology, in most respects, remains superior. And yet, based on this data, I would not be surprised if they find some way to make this engagement far more difficult than our current projections suggest." "What do you recommend?" Vesic asked. Cale hesitated before answering. "I recommend caution, Commander. A measured approach. Perhaps an attempt at genuine negotiation before we commit to any direct confrontation. The cost of underestimating this species again could be severe." Vesic considered the recommendation carefully, weighing it against the expectations of the Council that had authorized this fleet in the first place. The Council had made clear their intention to secure the sector through a demonstrated show of strength, believing that overwhelming force would be enough to convince the humans to accept assembly terms without significant resistance. But the growing body of evidence suggested that such an approach might prove far riskier than anyone in the Council chambers had anticipated. "I will consider it," Vesic said finally. "For now, continue monitoring their preparations. I want updated reports daily." As the Velkaran fleet drew closer to human space, tension grew on both sides of the widening gap between them. Diplomatic channels remained open, though communication proved difficult, each side struggling to understand the other's priorities and concerns. Vesic attempted, on several occasions, to open genuine dialogue with human representatives, hoping to find some path toward resolution that would not require the costly confrontation his own analysts increasingly warned against. General Louise Fairweather, representing humanity in these tense exchanges, found herself repeatedly frustrated by the Assembly's insistence on framing negotiations around territorial concessions and tribute, terms that no human leadership was willing to accept. They keep speaking as though we should simply hand over control of our own space, Louise said during one particularly tense meeting with her senior staff. As though our right to exist here is something they get to decide. Perhaps that is exactly how they see it, Nathan Price suggested. Based on everything we've learned about the Assembly, they've expanded through exactly this kind of pressure for generations. Most species, faced with a fleet of that size, simply comply. Then it's time they learned we're not most species, Louise said firmly. The turning point came nearly a month after the incident at Outpost Kessler, when the Velkaran fleet finally arrived at the edge of human-controlled space, positioning itself near the border colony of New Meridian, in what was clearly intended as a final, decisive show of force. Vesic hoped, even at this late stage, that the sheer scale of his fleet might convince the humans to accept negotiated terms without further conflict. Instead, he found himself facing a defense fleet far larger and more determined than his analysts had predicted, supported by colony defenses that had been reinforced with a speed and ingenuity that continued to defy Assembly expectations. Makeshift weapon platforms, hastily constructed from repurposed mining equipment, dotted the space around New Meridian. Civilian vessels, converted for defense, flew in tight, disciplined formations, alongside military ships, every pilot understanding exactly what was at stake. They should not have been able to prepare this quickly, Cale Doran said, studying the readings with visible unease. This level of coordination, this scale of mobilization, in the time frame available to them, should not have been possible. And yet here it is, Vesic replied quietly. A tense standoff followed, both fleets holding position as diplomatic channels remained open, each side waiting to see who would make the first move. Vesic found himself once again in direct communication with General Louise Fairweather, both leaders searching for some path forward that would avoid the devastating conflict neither of them truly wanted, despite the pressure from their respective councils and command structures. Commander Thorne, Louise said, during their final exchange before the standoff reached its breaking point, you have seen what we're capable of when threatened. I would urge you to consider whether this confrontation is truly necessary for either of our peoples. Vesic studied her image on the screen, searching for any sign of the fear or hesitation he had expected from a species so young, so seemingly unprepared for conflict on this scale. He found none, only a calm, steady resolve that unsettled him more than any weapon could have. I have made my recommendations to my council, Vesic replied honestly. The decision on how to proceed no longer rests entirely with me. Then perhaps, Louise said, it's time your council heard directly from us, rather than relying only on reports and assumptions. What followed was not the swift, decisive victory the Velkaran Council had envisioned when authorizing the fleet's departure weeks earlier. Instead, a prolonged, tense engagement unfolded near New Meridian, one defined not by overwhelming force from either side, but by a grinding, exhausting test of will and resourcefulness. Human pilots, flying ships that were often outclassed in raw power, relied instead on unpredictable tactics and rapid adaptation, finding ways to exploit weaknesses in Velkaran formations that Assembly strategists had never anticipated. Vesic watched from his flagship as engagement after engagement unfolded in ways that defied his fleet's carefully prepared strategies. Human ships that should have retreated in the face of overwhelming firepower instead pressed forward, finding gaps in Velkaran defenses through sheer persistence and creative improvisation. Colony defenses that his analysts had assessed as minimal proved far more resilient than expected, adapting and strengthening with each passing hour of conflict. Commander, Alira reported during a tense briefing partway through the engagement, our own fleet is beginning to sustain damage far exceeding our initial projections. Several vessels have reported unconventional tactics from human pilots that our combat protocols did not account for. Casualties? Vesic asked. Moderate on our side, lower than expected on theirs, given the disparity in raw firepower between our fleets. Vesic absorbed this information in silence, his mind returning once again to the historical records that had first raised his concerns weeks earlier. This was not the swift, decisive engagement the Council had envisioned. This was becoming exactly the kind of costly, unpredictable conflict his analysts had warned against from the very beginning. As the standoff near New Meridian stretched into its second day, both sides began to feel the weight of a confrontation that showed no clear sign of resolving in either fleet's favor. It was becoming increasingly clear, to commanders on both sides, that this engagement would not end with the simple, one-sided outcome either side had originally anticipated. Something would have to change, and soon, before the cost of continued conflict grew too high for either side to bear. On the second day of the standoff near New Meridian, a small Velkaran scout vessel found itself cut off from the main fleet after a chaotic exchange near the outer edge of the colony's defense line. Its pilot, a young officer named Cyril Tan, made a desperate attempt to retreat toward friendly lines, only to find their damaged engines failing at the worst possible moment. Within minutes, a human patrol vessel intercepted the crippled scout, and Cyril braced for what they assumed would be a swift and final end to their service in the assembly fleet. Instead, the human vessel simply drew alongside, disabled the scout's remaining weapon systems with careful precision, and requested surrender through an open channel, in a tone that struck Cyril as almost gentle, compared to the fierce reputation the assembly had already begun attaching to this species. Cyril surrendered without resistance, expecting harsh treatment once aboard the human vessel. What followed instead left the young officer deeply confused. A medical team examined and treated a minor injury Cyril had sustained during the engagement. Food and water were offered without hesitation. A translator worked patiently to establish basic communication, and though questions were asked about the fleet's movements and objectives, there was no cruelty in the process, no attempt to intimidate or harm. "You are being treated fairly," the human officer overseeing Cyril's care explained, a calm woman named Grace Bellamy, who Cyril would later learn had been part of the very first encounter with the assembly weeks earlier. "We don't believe in mistreating prisoners, regardless of the circumstances that brought them here." "Why?" Cyril asked, genuinely puzzled by the question even as it left their mouth. "Your species has been attacked, threatened. Why show mercy to someone from the fleet responsible?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "Because kindness isn't something we save only for people who've earned it through convenience. It's something we choose, especially when it would be easier not to." The exchange was later relayed back to the assembly fleet through diplomatic channels, as part of an offer to arrange Cyril's safe return in exchange for a renewed attempt at genuine negotiation. Vesic read the transcript of Cyril's treatment with a growing sense of disbelief, turning the report over in his mind again and again, searching for some hidden motive or strategy behind what appeared, on the surface, to be simple, unforced decency. "This does not fit any pattern we have previously observed," Illyra admitted during a private briefing with Vesic shortly after the report arrived. "A species capable of the fierce, unpredictable resistance we have witnessed throughout this engagement, and yet equally capable of this kind of restraint and compassion toward a captured enemy combatant. It is difficult to reconcile these two aspects into a single, coherent understanding of their nature." Vesic nodded slowly, staring at the transcript on his desk. "Perhaps that is precisely the point, Illyra. Perhaps we have been trying to understand them through the wrong lens entirely. We have been searching for a single explanation, a single defining trait, when the truth may simply be that they contain both capacities fully, fierce defense and genuine kindness, without contradiction." Cale Doran, who had remained quiet through much of the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice carrying a note of genuine unease. "Commander, our xenobiology division has begun circulating an informal classification for this species, based on the data we've gathered throughout this engagement. They are referring to humans as an apex species, currently unaware of the full extent of their own capabilities." "Explain," Vesic said. "Every trait we have observed," Cale continued, "the resilience, the adaptability, the willingness to take extreme risks for the benefit of others, the fierce, creative resistance under threat, and now this capacity for genuine compassion, even toward a defeated enemy. These are not contradictory traits, Commander. They are the traits of a species built for survival, at the very top of whatever environment it finds itself in. A species that thrives specifically because it can be both fiercely protective and genuinely kind, depending entirely on what a given situation requires." Vesic absorbed this assessment in silence, his mind turning over the implications carefully. Throughout the Assembly's long history of expansion, species had been cataloged and classified according to relatively simple metrics: technological capability, military strength, resource availability. Rarely had any species presented such a complex, seemingly contradictory profile, one that resisted easy categorization at every turn. "If this assessment is accurate," Vesic said slowly, "then we have made a grave miscalculation from the very beginning of this engagement. We approached this species as a target to be tested and pressured into submission, based entirely on assumptions about their youth and their limited technological development. We failed to account for the possibility that their true strength might lie in something far harder to measure and far more dangerous to underestimate." The report reached the Assembly Council within hours, carried alongside updated tactical assessments from the ongoing standoff near New Meridian. Reaction among council members remained divided. Some continued to argue for a renewed, more aggressive push, believing that any hesitation now would only allow the humans to grow stronger and more entrenched. Others, increasingly influenced by the mounting evidence Vesic's team had compiled, began pushing for a genuine reconsideration of the Assembly's approach toward this unexpectedly complex species. Commander Thessaly Kor, who had initially dismissed concerns about humanity as exaggeration during the earlier council meeting, found herself reviewing the latest reports with a far more serious expression than before. "I confess," she admitted during a tense council session, "I did not believe the initial assessments when they were first presented. I believed we were dealing with an unusual but ultimately manageable species, one that had simply gotten fortunate in a handful of early encounters. This latest evidence suggests something far more significant and far more concerning." "What do you propose, Commander Kor?" Oren Vale asked, his careful neutrality finally giving way to genuine curiosity about where this discussion might lead. Thessaly considered the question carefully before answering. "I propose we consider, seriously, whether continued conflict with this species serves our interests at all. If humanity truly possesses the combination of resilience, adaptability, and moral conviction our reports suggest, then any prolonged engagement risks costing us far more than any potential gains from expansion into their sector." The debate stretched on for hours, voices rising and falling as commanders and diplomats wrestled with the implications of everything they had learned since the initial incident at Outpost Kessler. Throughout the discussion, Vesic found himself reflecting on his own direct interactions with human leadership, particularly his exchanges with General Louise Fairweather during the tense standoff near New Meridian. He remembered her calm, steady resolve, utterly unshaken by the overwhelming force arrayed against her people. He remembered the reports of ordinary civilians, farmers and engineers and shopkeepers, stepping forward without hesitation to defend their homes alongside trained soldiers. He remembered Cyril Tan's confused, grateful account of the treatment received aboard a human vessel, kindness offered freely to a defeated enemy, with no expectation of anything in return. "I believe," Vesic said finally, addressing the full council with a conviction he had not felt at the beginning of this mission, "that we are facing a species whose true strength lies not in their technology, which remains genuinely inferior to our own in many respects, but in something far more fundamental. A combination of fierce determination and genuine compassion that we have consistently underestimated throughout this entire encounter. I recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that we pursue a genuine, respectful path toward peaceful resolution, rather than continuing to test the limits of what this species is truly capable of." The council fell silent, weighing Vesic's recommendation against the pride and ambition that had driven the Assembly's expansion for generations. It was Thessaly Kor who finally broke the silence, her voice carrying the weight of genuine reconsideration. "I second Commander Thorne's recommendation," she said. "I believe we have learned, through considerable cost, that this is not a species we wish to make an enemy of, when the alternative of mutual respect and cooperation remains available to us." One by one, other voices around the council chamber echoed similar sentiments, the tide of opinion shifting decisively away from continued confrontation and toward genuine negotiation. It was not a unanimous decision, and lingering skepticism remained among some of the more traditional voices within the Assembly, but the momentum toward peaceful resolution had become undeniable. Back near New Meridian, the standoff continued into its third tense day, both fleets holding position, while diplomatic channels worked to translate the shifting mood within the Velkaran Council into concrete terms both sides could accept. General Louise Fairweather, watching the negotiations unfold with cautious optimism, found herself reflecting on everything her people had endured and accomplished since the very first alarm had sounded aboard Outpost Kessler weeks earlier. "They're actually considering peace," Nathan Price said, reviewing the latest diplomatic transmissions with visible relief. "Genuine peace, not just a temporary retreat before another attempt." "It seems that way," Louise agreed, though caution remained in her voice. "But we won't lower our guard until terms are finalized and confirmed." As negotiations continued, Vesic requested a final, direct conversation with Louise, hoping to personally convey the shift in his own understanding and the recommendations he had made to his council. When the connection opened, both leaders regarded each other with a mixture of exhaustion and cautious respect, two people who had spent weeks preparing for a conflict that now seemed, finally, on the verge of resolution. "Commander Thorne," Louise said, "I understand your council is reconsidering its position." "They are," Vesic confirmed, "and I wanted you to know, directly, that my own recommendation played a part in that reconsideration. I believe, General Fairweather, that we approached your species with assumptions that proved deeply mistaken, and I regret the cost that mistake has already carried for both our peoples." Louise studied him carefully before responding. "Apologies are appreciated, Commander, but what matters most now is what comes next. If your council is genuinely prepared to pursue peaceful terms, we're prepared to listen." "I believe they are," Vesic said, "and I believe, having witnessed firsthand what your people are capable of, both in conflict and in compassion, that peaceful terms serve both our interests, far better than continued confrontation ever could." The conversation marked a genuine turning point, one that would soon lead to formal negotiations and, eventually, a carefully constructed peace agreement between humanity and the Velkaran Assembly. But even as hope for resolution grew, both leaders understood that the coming days would require patience, careful diplomacy, and a willingness from both sides to move beyond the assumptions and mistakes that had brought them to the brink of a costly, unnecessary conflict in the first place. The formal peace talks began 7 days after Commander Vesic Thorne's final conversation with General Louise Fairweather, held aboard a neutral station positioned carefully between human and Velkaran territory. Neither side wanted to negotiate on the other's ground, and so a small, unremarkable outpost, formerly used for scientific research before the crisis began, was chosen as the site where two very different civilizations would attempt to build something neither had truly expected: a lasting peace, forged not from conquest, but from mutual, hard-earned respect. Louise arrived aboard a modest diplomatic vessel, accompanied by a small team that included Daniel Hargrove, whose first-hand experience with the very first encounter at Outpost Kessler made him an invaluable presence at the table, and Grace Bellamy, whose sharp analytical mind had proven essential throughout the entire crisis. Vesic arrived shortly after, accompanied by Alira Vance and Cale Doran, the same trusted advisors who had guided him through weeks of uncertainty and shifting understanding. The first meeting was tense, both delegations settling into a large, circular chamber designed to place every participant on equal footing, no head of the table, no position of dominance. Louise studied Vesic across the room, remembering their tense exchanges during the standoff near New Meridian, while Vesic found himself studying Daniel with quiet curiosity, recognizing him as the very officer whose stubborn resistance aboard Outpost Kessler had first set this entire chain of events into motion. "Let's begin with something simple," Louise said, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the room. "What does the Velkaran Assembly actually want from this sector?" Vesic considered the question carefully before answering honestly. "Access. Trade. Resources that remain scarce across much of our territory. We approached your species initially believing intimidation would secure these things quickly and with minimal cost. We were wrong, and I believe that mistake has already cost both our peoples more than either side intended." "And now?" Daniel asked. "Now," Vesic said, "I believe there is a better path available to us, one built on genuine exchange rather than coercion, trade agreements, shared access to resources within this sector, negotiated fairly rather than demanded through threat of force." Louise exchanged a brief glance with her team before responding. That's a conversation we're willing to have, Commander. But it starts with clear boundaries and mutual respect. Our colonies remain under our control. Any agreement we reach must reflect that as a non-negotiable foundation. Agreed, Vesic said, without hesitation. The negotiations that followed, stretching across nearly 2 weeks of careful, sometimes difficult discussion, gradually built the framework for what would eventually become a formal treaty between humanity and the Velkaran Assembly. Trade routes were established, carefully negotiated to benefit both civilizations without compromising the sovereignty either side considered essential. Diplomatic channels were formalized, ensuring that future disagreements could be addressed through dialogue, rather than the kind of costly, unnecessary conflict that had nearly consumed both peoples in recent weeks. Throughout the negotiations, small moments of genuine connection began to emerge between the two delegations, moments that gradually softened the wary distance that had defined their earliest interactions. Grace Bellamy spent hours in quiet conversation with Alira Vance, the two analysts finding unexpected common ground in their shared fascination with understanding the patterns and behaviors of unfamiliar cultures. Daniel Hargrove and Cale Doran, initially guarded around each other, gradually developed a cautious mutual respect, born from long conversations about the strange, unpredictable path that had brought their two civilizations from the brink of devastating conflict to the possibility of genuine partnership. Cyril Tan, the young Velkaran officer who had been treated with such unexpected kindness during their brief captivity aboard a human vessel, requested and received permission to join the negotiating delegation as an informal cultural liaison, eager to help bridge the remaining gaps of understanding between two civilizations still learning how to interpret each other's customs and priorities. I did not expect to find myself grateful for having been captured, Cyril admitted to Grace, during one of the many breaks between formal negotiating sessions. But that experience taught me more about your people than any report or historical record ever could. Grace smiled at the admission. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the situations we least expect. As the treaty negotiations neared their conclusion, both delegations gathered for a final formal session, where the completed agreement would be reviewed and signed by representatives from both civilizations. Louise and Vesic stood together at the center of the chamber, each holding a copy of the carefully negotiated document that would formally establish peace between their peoples. Before we finalize this, Vesic said quietly, addressing Louise directly, I want to acknowledge something openly, in front of both our delegations. When my fleet first encountered your outpost, we saw a young, technologically limited species, and we assumed that meant weakness. We were wrong. Not only about your capabilities, but about the very nature of what makes a species truly formidable. Your strength was never simply in your weapons or your ships. It was in your people, in a resilience and compassion that our own history had never quite prepared us to recognize. Louise nodded slowly, considering her response carefully before speaking. We've made our own assumptions along the way, Commander. We assumed conflict was inevitable the moment your fleet appeared at our border. It took time, and no small amount of difficulty, for both our peoples to recognize that a different path was possible. I'm grateful we found it before the cost became too high to bear. The formal signing that followed was witnessed not only by the delegations present, but broadcast across both human and Velkaran territory, a symbolic gesture meant to demonstrate the genuine commitment both civilizations were making toward a peaceful, cooperative future. Across human colonies, from the crowded city centers of Earth to the distant outposts along the border, people gathered to watch the historic moment unfold, many of them still processing the strange, unsettling weeks that had brought their entire civilization to the edge of a conflict few had ever imagined facing. In the months that followed, the treaty between humanity and the Velkaran Assembly gradually transformed the relationship between the two civilizations, from wary suspicion into something resembling genuine partnership. Trade flourished along the newly established routes, bringing unfamiliar goods and technologies to both human and Velkaran markets. Cultural exchange programs, initially met with hesitation on both sides, grew steadily as curiosity overcame lingering caution, with scholars and scientists from both civilizations eager to learn from perspectives so different from their own. Word of humanity's unexpected resilience spread far beyond Velkaran space. carried along trade routes and diplomatic channels to other civilizations within the broader galactic community that the Assembly had long been part of. Rumors and reports mixed with genuine first-hand accounts, gradually building a reputation for humanity that few could have predicted only months earlier. Species that had never even heard of Earth before now spoke of it with a mixture of curiosity and caution, drawn by tales of a young civilization whose members seemed willing to risk everything for people they had never even met, and whose fierce determination in the face of overwhelming odds had convinced an ancient, powerful coalition to abandon conquest in favor of genuine respect. Aboard a Velkaran trade vessel docked at a bustling station months after the treaty's signing, a young officer new to interstellar service found himself seated near a table of older, more experienced crew members, swapping stories over a shared meal. When the conversation turned, as it often did these days, to the subject of humanity, the young officer listened with genuine fascination as one of the older crew members recounted, with clear amusement, an incident involving a human diplomat who had visited their station months earlier. "She apologized," the older officer said, shaking his head with a small, disbelieving laugh, "for accidentally stepping on my foot in a crowded corridor. Apologized profusely, checked to make sure I was all right, even offered to find a medic if I needed one. And this is the same species that held off a boarding party with nothing but barricades and stubbornness. The same species whose defense fleet made an entire Assembly War Council reconsider decades of expansion policy." The young officer laughed along with the rest of the table, though beneath the humor, a genuine sense of respect had settled into how the crew spoke of humanity these days. Fierce and gentle, dangerous and kind. A species that had, against every expectation the wider galaxy once held, proven itself capable of both extraordinary strength and extraordinary compassion, often within the very same breath. Back on Earth, Daniel Hargrove stood once again aboard Outpost Kessler, now fully repaired and expanded following the incident that had started everything months earlier. He looked out through the observation window at the quiet, star-filled space beyond, remembering the fear and uncertainty of that first alarm, the desperate scramble to hold their ground against overwhelming odds, and the long, uncertain path that had eventually led to genuine peace. Grace Bellamy joined him at the window, carrying 2 cups of coffee, one of which she offered to Daniel with a small, tired smile. "Strange to think how close we came to a very different outcome," she said, settling in beside him. "Strange," Daniel agreed, "but I think we handled it about as well as anyone could have hoped." "Do you think this is really over?" Grace asked. "Genuine peace, not just a pause before something worse?" Daniel considered the question carefully, thinking of everything they had witnessed and endured over the past several months, the fear and the resolve, the conflict and the eventual, hard-earned understanding between 2 civilizations who had once seemed destined for devastating war. "I think," he said finally, "that we proved something important to them, and maybe to ourselves as well. We're not looking for conflict. We never were. But we're not going to back down from it either, not when the people and places we care about are on the line. I think that's a lesson worth remembering, for us just as much as for them." Grace nodded, sipping her coffee, as she gazed out at the quiet expanse of stars beyond the window, a peaceful, uneventful sight that felt, after everything they had endured, like a genuine gift, rather than something to be taken for granted. Far beyond the edge of human space, the story of Outpost Kessler, and the tense, unlikely path toward peace, between humanity and the Velkaran Assembly, continued to spread, growing with each retelling, into something between historical account and cautionary legend. A reminder, carried across countless star systems and shared among species who had never even met a human directly, that appearances could be deeply deceiving, and that true strength often revealed itself not through size or technology, but through the quiet, stubborn refusal to abandon what mattered most, no matter the odds arrayed against it. And somewhere among the stars, humanity continued forward, still young by galactic standards, still learning its place among the vast, unfamiliar civilizations, now sharing the wider universe with them, carrying forward the same quiet resilience and unexpected kindness that had, against every early expectation, transformed a moment of near catastrophe into the beginning of a genuine, lasting peace.